Okay, there are many researchers who have written many books on the extraterrestrial-related phenomena, but there are few actual historians formally trained in the field. Our next speaker ascended to an elite status within that group with a publication in 2002 of UFOs in the National Security State, Chronology of a Cover-Up from 1947 to 1973. Volume 2. He will further solidify his role with the publication of Volume 2 later this year.
This historian's approach is not by accident. He studied history, English, and philosophy at Alfred University. He received a scholarship to study at Oxford University, but instead chose to do graduate work at the University of Rochester, where he focused on German and Soviet studies before moving on to the American Cold War diplomacy.
Not wanting to teach, he left academia to write. In 1994, he became interested in the UFO issue, approaching it from the angle of history and politics. He was intrigued by the cultural schizophrenia, the fact that mainstream and academic official culture continued to treat UFOs as amusement, while so many highly accomplished people privately took it so seriously.
Throughout 1995, 96, and 97, he conducted a systematic bibliographic search, hunting down the many out-of-print books and UFO documents released over the years through the Freedom of Information Act. He found the amount of information nearly overwhelming. A detailed chronology of relevant events was prepared in advance of writing his critically acclaimed first book, which provided a clear, comprehensive, but concise historical narrative of the problem. He will soon announce the completion of the study's second volume, which will take the story deeper into the 20th century, and of course he'll be coming here to tell us all about that.
And in between being a husband, father, and author, he found time also to become a sci-fi channel TV star. Is the big screen next? Who knows? Is he the next Jonathan Turley? Please welcome Richard Dolan to X Conference 2008.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Stephen. It's very, very nice to be here again. It's always an honor. If the feedback is too high, I'll step away from the mic. I don't know if that makes it better. It doesn't matter. Yes, thank you. A word very briefly about the status of my next book, UFOs in the National Security State, Volume 2. I wrote Volume 1 many years ago. It was right after the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. You remember that? And so that was a while ago, and now the second volume is on the way. I'll have it done later this year. It's a 3-volume study that I'm working on, which will take, so Volume 2 will go from the end of 73 to 1991. And that should be done later this year, and that'll be about 500 pages. And then Volume 3, the research for which is completely finished, I'm happy to say, will cover from 1991 to the present day. And I don't think that'll take forever to do, since, as I mentioned, the research is done. So we'll see. It took a long time, truthfully, for me to get up to speed on all of the last few decades worth of history. Today, I'm here to talk about some of the themes I discuss in my book, but really, this is a 3-part lecture. I think I've broken it into 3 neat segments. And I've titled it The Challenges of UFO Disclosure. The first part is really for the benefit of those of you here who may be new to this field. If there's media or outside people who don't read UFO books all the time and wonder what all the fuss is about. And so it's a brief documentary kind of discussion of why this topic should be taken seriously, what is the evidence for it being a big deal. Some of those documents, I think, will give a pretty good idea of what's actually going on. The second theme that I'll be discussing will concern what I think is the likely nature of the cover-up itself, and on a very human political level. And then the third segment is going a little bit further into the water still, and that will deal with the nature of them, who these others may be, who are behind the UFO phenomenon, and what it will mean for us to be dealing with them, if we deal with them ever in an open way. So a lot of it will deal with what has become known as exopolitics, what I find when I think about the matter of exopolitics is that I like to think that I have ideas about it that are not necessarily the most widely promulgated ideas about it. So you'll hear something a little different. First, I want to start with a basic documentary history. One thing that we can say regarding all of this phenomenon is that it's a very confrontational history. And what I would argue is that, I mean, there's disputed documents, but then there are open documents that are beyond dispute. And I think these documents show that UFOs have received a great deal of serious attention from the military. It's something that is often very provocative and confrontational at times. Violations of sensitive airspace to start with, attempted jet interceptions on a fairly regular basis. So that whatever else is happening in this phenomenon, whatever the nature of these beings or people may be, that there's something that's not right. There's trouble in paradise, maybe even a silent Cold War. What follows here is a short list of what I think are some key to UFO documents. There's about 15 here that I'm listing here. These are some images of a few of them that we've received through archival research and freedom of information and so on. There are many, many hundreds, even thousands of UFO documents. There's hundreds of good ones, in my opinion, and then there's a few that are really, really excellent. The very famous 1947 memo by General Nathan Twining, in which General Twining, in answer to another general's query on this matter, says that, well, according to the reports that we are getting in, Twining was the head of Air Material Command at the time at Wright Field, he said this phenomenon appears to be real, not visionary or fictitious, and then goes on to describe in amazing detail the characteristics that military personnel were getting about these UFOs, including domed, flat on bottom, domed on top, generally silent, evasive maneuvers when sighted, and so on. Domed. All right, so what's a flat on bottom, domed on top aircraft in 1947? A 1949 memo from the FBI that states very explicitly that the military considered the matter of flying saucers to be top secret. Rather interesting statement. A 1950 document dealing with airspace violations over the Hanford nuclear facility, in which anti-aircraft battalion were alerted, and a whole bunch of people were up in arms over this. A fascinating memo from the end of 1952 in which the Director of Scientific Intelligence for the CIA, H. Marshall Chadwell, is writing to his boss, Walter Beadle Smith, stating that these objects traveling at such altitudes and speeds are not attributable to atmospheric phenomena or known types of aerial vehicles. So basically stating to the director of the CIA that we have something here that is serious and doesn't appear to be anything that we can explain. A fascinating memo from the Oak Ridge facility in 1953 about a sighting of a black UFO coming out of a cloud by one of the engineers at Oak Ridge, describing maneuvers that were astonishing. You know, going at incredible speed, stopping, joined by two other objects, and then taking off at an amazing speed. An emergency memo from Maxwell Air Force Base in 1954 with a detailed description of the object by one of the pilots there. A 1955 Air Force radar visual UFO tracking, 29-minute out of near Pepperell Air Force Base. A landing case near Minot Air Force Base from 1966 in which a strike team was sent to investigate this object that came down, disrupted their electronics as they approached this thing, and then they saw it take off. And according to the document that we have on this, NORAD tracked it going at like 100,000 feet altitude for quite some time. A year following that, in 1967, a very well-known case out of Malmstrom Air Force Base, we've got the documentation on this, in which a red glowing thing came over and disabled a number of ICBMs. No explanation for this, so they had the ability to disable our missile defense. A 1969 memo from General Carol Bolander, which essentially, this is right after the Air Force Project Blue Book had closed, and officially that was the only investigative body that the US military had on UFOs. Bolander stated here that, well, in fact, UFO matters that have to do with national security are not part of the Blue Book system anyway. So in other words, stating that there were separate channels for investigation of this matter. A series of documents from 1975 having to do with utterly awesome, astonishing violations of sensitive airspace along the northern US border and into Canada by objects that to this day remain unknown. 1976, the famous Iranian Air Force encounter with 2 successive F-4s trying to intercept this object that disabled their electronic and communication system. We have a spectacular DIA report dealing with that in great detail. 1978 State Department memo dealing with some kind of strange thing that went down in Bolivia. It's a very interesting case. A memo dealing with the famous Rendlesham landing case from late 1980. And then we've got some pretty good documentation dealing with the Belgian Triangle sightings of 1989 and 1990. There's much more. I think that these are some of the better ones that are out there. And what they show to me, if there's a journalist here or if there are academicians who are here who really want to dig into this in a serious way, without going too far afield yet, because this is one of these topics where you can go very, very deep if you wish, but of course the terrain gets a little less stable the further out you go. But if you want to just stick with unarguable factual evidence to show that this is a real phenomenon that deserves serious attention by serious people, then start with some of these documents and then take it from there. That's what I did. 15 years ago, I stumbled across this topic, really knowing very little about it, and I did know a little bit about history, and I thought, well, this is interesting, and is there something to this so-called cover-up? You always hear about people claiming that there's a cover-up, and I got this little bug inside my head, and I thought, well, I want to find out. I decided to do a little 3-4 month side project, and not really trying to find out, are UFOs real? I wasn't that far along at all. I just wanted to know, was this a valid historical topic? Did important people take it seriously? And if they did, why had I not ever read about it in any academic history book, ever? Even if it was a mistake, would it not be interesting? Of course it would be. And so I just decided to look into it and find out what's the evidence that the believers were putting out. And I think some of these documents that I've indicated are some of that evidence. But there's more going on than just a bare-bones recitation of some of these government documents. What it's very clearly looking like when you start looking at the totality of this is that there's a lot of confrontation going on. Some of the documents I just mentioned indicate a bit of that. It looks as though I think it's a reasonable argument to say that there have been a number of cases where UFOs have come down and they've been recovered. In the 1970s, I'm not going to go through all of these things here. This is just a list of some encounters from the 70s that are interesting, that have good data to support them, showing jet chase after jet chase after jet chase of unknown objects that appear to be extraordinary in their construction and their capabilities. Some of them are truly amazing. The last one on that list from December 78, dealing with 2 Chilean F-5s, I've already written about for my next book. It's just incredible, incredible stuff. And we don't almost ever know about these things, especially here in America. We tend to be rather insular and provincial about UFO history, but there's a big, big world out there with a lot of incredible events that have been going on. Another one of those, these are some encounters from the 1980s. Many people in this room are probably familiar with the Bent Waters incident of December 1980, but in my opinion, possibly more spectacular than that was a few months earlier in Peru, May 9th and May 10th of 1980 by the Peruvian Air Force. 2 days in a row, there was this round UFO hovering near a Peruvian Air Force airfield. And on the first of these days, May 9th, a pilot was sent up in a fighter interceptor to look at this object, and he ended up firing on it, according to a Defense Intelligence Agency document. He fired at the UFO to no effect. The object then just took off and completely outperformed his aircraft. And then the following day, the same thing happened, except that this time the jet was scrambled. He did not fire on the object, but then tried to chase it and didn't have a chance. And so it goes. The Soviet Union appears to have had its own share of dramatic encounters with same objects. When the whole house of cards was falling apart in 1989, 1990, during that period of Soviet history, it was really the opportunity for a number of leaks to occur, for a number of people who felt, well, here's my opportunity to talk about a little bit of this hidden history. And so a number of people talked. One of those was a Soviet Deputy Minister of Defense named Ivan Tretyak. In 1990, he said, yes, there were quite a few cases where Soviet jets encountered UFOs. He said 40. At first, he said the policy was to shoot. He said, but we lost too many of pilots, and then a new order went into place, which was simply to monitor but evade when necessary. Don't engage. It was his opinion that the US policy was more aggressive. There was another person within the Soviet defense establishment, a Colonel Boris Sokolov, who confirmed that there were thousands of Soviet UFO cases during the 1980s. It's not as, the documentation on this isn't always as satisfying as we would like, but it does look to me that there is something very, very significant going on there too. Through the 1990s, here in our own country, there are many cases of jets appearing to intercept UFOs. They're not all slam dunk National Archive documents. The documentation becomes a little bit more difficult to get in the 1990s. But there are a number of, I would say, pretty good eyewitness accounts indicating numerous instances in which US jet fighters are chasing UFOs. There's two there that I've mentioned on this slide. A Georgia case from 1994 and Indiana case from 1996. In which we appear to be chasing these objects across the sky in vain. There is a very well-known case that took place very close to where we are right now in July of 2002, seen by a number of residents of Waldorf, Maryland. This is an interesting case because we have confirmation by the Air Force that it took place, not in any kind of government document, but we do have Air Force spokespersons telling the Washington Post, yes, we did scramble some jets to chase an unknown object. Well, what happened was one government employee, a fellow named Rennie Rogers, who's probably the best known of the witnesses, but he's only one of about 10 or 12 who phoned in this sighting to their local radio station. But he was home from work. It was 1:30 in the morning. He was watching television, and he heard the rumble of jets over his house. So he ran out, and he saw the jets in the distance, I guess. I think that's what he saw. But then the main thing is he saw this object descend, he said, at an 80-degree angle and stop. It was blue. And then the jets turned around and came after this thing. And he said, and that's when this object just went, shoo, took off and was gone, with the jets having no opportunity, no chance to get this thing. That story was reported in a much, much less dramatic fashion in the Washington Post article that described it. The Post article, though, did state that the two F-16s were chasing a blue object that was unknown. The other neat thing about that article was that it did quote an anonymous Air Force person who said, yes, we had it on radar too, and at some point it just blipped right off the radar. That was kind of weird. So that was something new. The Air Force spokesperson, you'd hate to have to be these guys, to have to go to the media and to just, make these totally ridiculous statements. Like he said, well, yes, they were scrambled to chase us, but it could have been any number of things. Not saying what things it could have been. I'd like to know what blue object. This is post 9/11 America. It's 2002, right outside, very close to Washington, D.C. You've got jets scrambled to chase this thing that can outperform them. What number of things could this be? Well, he didn't really get into that part of it, unfortunately. Then we have Stephenville just a few months ago in Texas, which I think is a very interesting case. I think that there's more information about this that will soon come out. But you have several dozens of witnesses who seem to be quite consistent in what they said they saw. A very, very fast-moving, low-flying, silent object. One of them described it as like a flying Walmart because it was so big. That's what he said. I didn't make this up. It appears to have been stationary for a short while, too. This thing was big. And they said, and then it took off, and that there were jets chasing it, F-16 jets. And as you probably recall, if you followed the story, the Air Force initially denied everything, and they said, well, it was very likely a misidentification, a reflection of a commercial airliner that they saw in the distance, et cetera, et cetera. But then, I don't know how this was going to happen. I'm willing to bet that the F-16s were going to be confirmed, that their existence was going to be confirmed, although I don't know this. But what did happen is that the Air Force did eventually confirm that there were F-16s in the area on a training mission, they said. So, in other words, the point is that these witnesses, had already said, yes, F-16s were chasing this thing. So you have corroboration of that part. So what about the first part, the big fat UFO? Well, and this poor Air Force spokesperson, what is he going to say? There's really, what are you going to say? Oh, well, yeah, there's this big-ass flying Walmart that can outfly our F-16s, but don't worry, I don't think they're going to eat us. I mean, there's nothing that he can say that's going to make this issue any easier. So they have to lie. So the summary up till now, I guess I would say that there's an extensive amount of documentation that the military is interested in UFOs. There's very good reason to believe that this is a serious matter. There have been many attempted interceptions, many attempted close encounters. We appear to be trying to shoot them down sometimes. I didn't really get into the evidence for crash retrievals. I'll discuss it in a few minutes in passing. I don't intend to really deal with it in detail today. But I think that there's good evidence that there have been retrievals of some of these downed objects and a silent Cold War. It's a hidden part of our history. Back when I was writing my book, I did coin the phrase cultural schizophrenia. I think I coined it. I didn't read it anywhere else. And I think it's apt, because really what it does is it describes, it's a feeling, it's a sense of, well, there's official history, there's official truth, and then there's all the other stuff, the unofficial truth. I think that that's how the world is. There are always those who have power, who have preponderant influence over the dissemination of truth, and then there's the rest of us. Now, a lot of that stuff that's unofficial truth is bogus and not legitimate, but certainly in the case of the UFO phenomenon, the official truth is that there's no phenomenon there, really. That's nothing serious. It's all fun and games. But clearly, I think we can say that there's, in fact, something very, very serious going on. So we have a discrepancy, a disconnect. So now let me move to the second part of this. I wonder how I'm doing with time here. I'm notoriously really bad with... Hour and 5 minutes. Thank you. Perfect. Wow. Dealing with these objects now, let's move into the cover-up part of it. Through the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, and most of the 70s, UFO researchers were really not looking at crash retrievals. It wasn't part of the equation for the most part. When UFO researchers were talking about the cover-up, they were essentially talking about well, that there are government people who know that this is a real phenomenon and they're not telling us. Why aren't they telling us? Well, they're probably not telling us because they don't want to cause public panic. They don't think we can handle it, and so on. There wasn't this other part. But in the late 70s, there was one researcher who began to collect a large number of accounts. Okay, well, this is Leonard Stringfield. It was during the Carter years, and I think the presidency of Jimmy Carter is important here because when Carter was elected president, he had had the fortune or misfortune to have been outed as a UFO witness, and so people were interested in this, and he was asked a number of questions during his candidacy and made a couple of statements as a candidate to the effect, it was really pretty non-committal, really, but he did say, well, if I'm elected, I'll do what I can because I think it's an important topic. So then he becomes elected president, and there are some people who really put a lot of stock in that. And the Carter White House was flooded with mail. You can get a very good description of this on Grant Cameron's website, Presidential UFO. I'm handling it in my next book. So that there were people who were very optimistic, and they thought that 1977 was going to be a year in which the president might make some kind of announcement. I think that factored into one of the reasons Leonard Stringfield got so many people coming to him secretly in 77 and 78. He had just written a UFO book that dealt a little bit with the phenomenon of crash retrieval, dealt with it in passing. And then suddenly, the next thing he knows, he's collecting 10, then 20, then 40, then 50, then 60, then different accounts that dealt with Air Force people, military people who would say that they saw alien bodies in storage at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, or that they were part of a UFO crash retrieval. Things that had really been off the radar for UFO researchers now suddenly became on. It was very contentious. I wasn't involved during those periods, but looking back, you can see that it generated a lot of emotion. Not everyone believed Stringfield. But the fact is he kept getting more and more of these, and he wasn't making it up. And so the whole phenomenon now, the dimensions of the cover-up appeared to change. It's not just hiding the reality of them. It's now we have some of their stuff, and so the cover-up is a much more tangible, physical thing if you go that route. Well, let's rewind the clock a little bit. Earlier, when Steve Bassett was talking, he described how he felt it was completely legitimate to start the secrecy on UFOs in 1947. I can't argue against that. If you're President Harry Truman in 1947, and you're presented with this information from your top military and scientific people, they come to you and say, Mr. President, we've recovered technology, apparently, that wasn't manufactured by human hands. The United States had several issues at the time that were already very important. We had the monopoly of the atomic bomb, which the United Nations wanted to be brought under international control at the time. It was a big issue. America's answer was no. Of course not. We're not going to share that. Go right to the Soviets. It's ridiculous. So I think it's fair to say that they wouldn't want to share something as exotic as alien technology. So what would you do? Would you create a top secret, super secret group of highly reliable people who you would say to them, I think, figure this out. Let's get a team together. Let's come up with contingency plans and let's study the technology, see what we can do with it, and find out who these other beings are. Do we have anything to worry about? And so on. And so before we tell the world, let's figure a few things out. I think that's a reasonable thing to do, and I think that's what it looks like happened. An MJ-12 type of organization, yes, I think so. One thing that I think also happened is that to some extent, I don't know to what extent I could say, but I think to some extent, the nature of this cover-up has gone private. It's not, when we talk about a government cover-up, I don't really feel that that's entirely accurate. I think it's almost necessary to take the cover-up private. For example, if you're the Army, okay, and you've got this piece of technology, and now you have to do something with it. Well, I mean, there are people within the military who are highly scientifically trained and capable, but at some point, wouldn't you want to have your contractors look at this? I mean, they're the people who have the R&D and the engineering and the capability to make things for you. Whether it's General Electric or Raytheon or Boeing, all of these specialized companies that have the wherewithal to do this. At some point, it seems to me that you would have to be in touch with them and have them be in physical possession of some of this technology. And if you do that, presumably they would get patent rights off of all the neat ideas that they come up with based on this technology and so on. And it seems to be a very logical thing to do. When you look at the history of the US government, particularly in the last century, it's been dominated for the longest time by leaders of industry and finance anyway. That's where they come from. You have your advisors on the Council on Foreign Relations, which is industry and finance also. It's all it's a cozy kind of situation. It helps with secrecy in the sense also, because if the technology goes private, it becomes proprietary in a sense rather than classified. So but it's all still within the same clique or club, and it's just further removed from public prying eyes. So I think it's a very logical way to go. We have the statement sort of supporting this by Senator Barry Goldwater back in the late 70s, early 80s. He made a couple of statements dealing with UFOs and talked about his friendship with Air Force Chief of Staff General Curtis LeMay, and told about how LeMay just cussed him out one time when he talked about the rumors about bodies in Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and was not allowed to have access to them, and wrote to one constituent, this thing has gotten so highly classified, even though I will admit there is a lot that has been released, it is just impossible to get anything on it. He was writing that in 1981 after a lot of documents had been released through the Freedom of Information Act, and that's what he was referring to there. But you have a US senator, former presidential candidate, completely out of the loop, an Air Force, a general in the Air Force Reserve, no less, who was buddies with Curtis LeMay and could not get any access to this, but knew that there was something there. Now, Dr. Edgar Mitchell is here. I feel a little weird about bringing him up on the slide when he's here presenting, but I think it's important to make one statement about things that Dr. Mitchell has said. I've tracked a number of statements that he has made over the years on this topic. The earliest that I've been able to find was from 1997, where he discusses this exact issue, dealing with individuals that he has known. He's never given up their identities, and of course that's a reasonable thing to do. But has said since 97 that based on conversations he's had at the elite levels, that we're looking likely at reverse engineered technology in the hands of humans that are not under government control or any type of high-level control. Back-engineered technologies basically being controlled by a clique, former government intelligence now under private sector control. Maybe originally there was some oversight by the government, but it looks like today maybe not. I hope that he would be able to expand on that and discuss that during his lecture later in this conference. I think it's important too because Edgar Mitchell isn't just any person. He's an Apollo astronaut who went to the moon and is a national hero. And so whether that would constitute proof or not isn't even the issue. The fact that he's even talking about it at all and has gone on a public record, I just keep asking myself, where's NBC News here? I mean, honestly. Cheryl mentioned my little TV gig a little over a year ago on the Sci-Fi Channel. That was produced by NBC News. I got to chat with a number of pretty interesting news producers, and some of them friends of Tom Brokaw, and interesting people, very intelligent. And they discovered that I was into all this UFO stuff, and they said, well, you know, that would be a great story. We just really need evidence. And I said, well, I mean, God, people, what do you want? Go talk to Edgar Mitchell. Guy's Apollo 14, what more do you want? He's talking about this. He would talk to you, I'm sure. But they don't want to they don't really want that. I mean, I think it's a truism, and it's a false truism, that the mainstream media would be dying to have a topic to deal with. I think that they're afraid of this topic. The people that I dealt with, smart people, but they are terrified of dealing with this topic unless it's a total slam dunk. They do not, absolutely not, want to go out there. It's mortal terror for these people. I'll be handling questions after the lecture.
This is not a question, it's a statement. July of 2001, the head honcho of CNN was going to Newark Airport on I-95, and he saw a huge ship. And they said, and there was over 100 people that stopped. Every media outlet was the first thing that they would put on every station, and they just announced it, and then they stopped. But every network spoke about it.
July 2001 CNN discussion of the UFO sighting, that was one time. We can come back to that, and there'll be time for questions and answers later. In my private capacity, sometimes, I mean, my work in studying the history of UFOs is I don't like to deal with leaks when I can avoid it. I try to deal with open source material. I don't want to put myself in the position of having to have any reader of my book to have to trust me. That's not the way to go. But the reality is that sometimes people will come to you and they'll tell you things and they'll say, well, this is confidential, and what can you do? So you listen. And so in a few years of dealing with this, I've had a number of individuals who I would say are reasonably well plugged in and have said things to me. That doesn't constitute proof, but it colors my judgment at times. We always have to be careful, I understand. There's one scientist who spoke to me very plainly, face-to-face, about bodies that he said were absolutely deeply compartmented. This is a real thing. We have scientists studying alien technology and bodies. The person's well known, but I can't mention who he is. Another individual that I know, someone who is in appropriate circles, had met with a four-star general, former member of the Joint Chiefs, who had said to him the same type of thing, that there was an MJ-12 type of group, that it did not seem to be under adequate public control, and that it seemed to be more private than public. And in fact, spoke about a split in the ranks between the older and younger set in that clique, where the older individuals in it were more in favor of releasing information about this, and the younger ones were not. They were the hardliners. And the implication being that the younger ones were still busy making money off of their access to this technology. That's how it came down to me. Certainly, one thing that we could assume regarding all of this secrecy is that if you've got this technology, it would probably cost a fair amount of money, I would think, to study it and to try to replicate it to whatever extent you can, and that the sources for funding obviously have to remain hidden. Implicitly, I would argue, necessitating a subversion of our formal political system. I mean, we all know that there's a black budget, but when you start going 50, 60 years now, really, of a program that is totally off the books, at what point does the secrecy become more than simply a national security necessity? And at one point, does the secrecy really subvert the kind of political system that we like to think we have? There's really not a lot known, as far as I know, about the nature of how all this funding goes and things like special access programs and so on. There was a pretty good study, though, or an article, I should say, published by Bill Sweetman a few years ago, in 2000, for Jane's International Defense Review. There aren't that many of these articles. He wrote an article called In Search of the Pentagon's Billion-Dollar Hidden Budgets, How the U.S. Keeps Its R&D Spending Under Wraps. Now, Sweetman doesn't write about UFOs. He's an aerospace guy and deals with a lot of cutting-edge issues. I don't know of him having written about UFOs at all, but this article dealt with his analysis of special access programs and how they function. His estimate at the time, this is 8 years ago, was that there were probably about 150 of these special access programs. I'm going to guess there's quite a bit more now. And that they had little to no oversight in practice. I mean, legally, that there is some oversight of them, but in practice, he said, it doesn't look like there's much, if any, of them. And one of the main things that he determined was that these appeared to be dominated more by private contractors than by DoD personnel. His sense of them, the ones that what he was able to learn, was that that the DoD people were more like liaisons and served as funding gatekeepers to let the money into the program, but that the actual decisions were predominantly made by the private contractors. And I think that fits in with some of the things that are leaked about the nature of the UFO secrecy as well. Catherine Austin Fitts, someone else that's probably known to many people here. She was the Assistant Secretary of HUD under George Bush Sr. Is a financial whiz. She's written a lot of articles on finance that I have a hard time following. I admit it, but her argument is that at least about 85% of the US federal budget is literally not auditable. Like, God could not audit the budget. It's designed not to be auditable. She argued that HUD was, and probably other federal offices, were essentially cut-out operations for drug trafficking and securities fraud, things like this. She's written articles about it. And one of her articles dealt with the disappearance of over $3 trillion during the later years of the Clinton administration. In her article, What's Up with the Black Budget? A really interesting article. If you Google that article, you'll find it. It deals with E.T. as well. Very interesting. So I only reference her in this case to point out that I don't know where all that money went. Periodically, there are statements dealing with the disappearance of trillions of dollars. I don't know. But I assume that if there's a lot of unaccountable money floating around, that some of it could go into funding of deep black programs. If you're an intelligence operation, the last thing you want is accountable money, I would think. You'd want private sources of money that are not vouchered or not accountable. And so my instinct is that some of this money is related to some of the things that we're talking about. So how am I doing for time? I think I'm amazed. I'm just astonished. This is great. I really planned this lecture out a little bit more sanely than some of the others. If you've seen any of my other ones, I have too many slides. I'm rushing through it, speeding down a little country road, and it's just not fun. So we don't want that. We want it to be fun. I think we'll be okay here. What is the program all about? I think it's about a lot of things. I think it's primarily about developing this technology. It's one of the things. I think that it's about trying to make UFOs. What I don't know, what I won't pretend to know, is how successful we've gotten secretly. But it seems to be a no-brainer that if you've got this technology, you're going to try to replicate it. And the real question is, to what extent have we been able to do that? Now, you have some reason to think that we've gone places, that we've gotten somewhere with it. James Goodall is someone who I think is important in this. He's a journalist, aviation journalist, wrote for many of the prominent defense publications. This is before there was Bob Lazar. James Goodall was interviewing people who were working in secret facilities in Nevada. And his own conclusion was that there were a number of black programs flying out of Groom Lake, including a silent triangle. He had one source who had spent many years at Groom Lake. He asked this person, "Do you believe in UFOs?" And the individual replied, "Absolutely, positively, they exist." Another source in the mid-1980s told Goodall, "We have things in the Nevada desert that would make that are literally out of this world, better than Star Trek or anything you can see in the movies. Okay, well, there's no proof here. It's not like Goodall can just bring a craft out for anyone to see, but again, these are leaks that he got and he took seriously. George Knapp is another journalist. We know that George Knapp interviewed Bob Lazar. It was through Knapp that people learned about Bob Lazar. One of the interesting things about Lazar is, I mean, it's now 20 years after he hit the scene, and he's still extremely contentious. There are people who call him a fraud. But I've noticed that George Knapp has never done that. Never. And George Knapp is very careful with the way he describes Lazar. He has said, yeah, there are things that Bob Lazar has said that I don't find credible, but he always comes back to the fact that he says that there are things Lazar has said that I do find credible. One thing that Knapp has done is he also has interviewed a number of people who've worked in Groom Lake, inside the Nellis testing facility, and has said that many of these people corroborate large parts of what Bob Lazar has said, to wit that there are alien craft inside Groom Lake. So, for what it's worth, no one wants to mention this publicly, of course. No one's going to shout this from the rooftop. And then we have the case of the Nellis UFO from 1994. This was a video that leaked out in the beginning of 1995 to the TV show Hard Copy. The interesting thing about it is that it has, on the video, it's got data that can be analyzed. A number of people have analyzed it. They've put their analysis on public. Martin J. Powell and Dave Rudiak are two such people. What it looks like is that this object was capable of really extraordinary maneuverability. Within a brief couple of minutes of video, it attained a speed of up to 500 miles per hour, a low speed of 15 to 20 miles per hour. So it's an incredible range right there. And seems to have done a right-angle turn at very high speed. So the implication, it would appear that this was something that we were testing, although I guess you can never be sure, but it's within that facility. It was tracked. It was determined geographically that it was within the part of the Groom Lake facility. So was that one of ours? This is 1990s. This is 15, almost 12, 13, what years? 14 years ago. It's a long time ago. So it looks to me that we can say there's, I'm going to summarize here. I mentioned earlier that I think that there's some very good evidence for the UFO reality and for national security connections. I've talked about some aspects of the cover-up. I think that hiding the technology is an important part of that cover-up. But of course, that doesn't deal with everything. There's the matter of these other people. If that's what it looks like, I think that's what it looks like. You can look at this in two ways. You can, as a scientist in a lab, you can say, well, I refuse to believe in this nonsense until you show me tangible material evidence or some kind of proof. But you can also look at it as someone in intelligence or counterintelligence. In other words, use your brain and ask yourself, well, is it reasonable to assume that there are other beings here doing this? And I think, yes, of course. I think you'd be negligent in the extreme if you were involved in national security and you were not thinking about this. Even if you had no exact proof that it was alien per se, I think you'd have to look into it. So let me give you my own analysis or understanding of what I think is going on with them. Because if we're going to deal with them in any way, we have to ask ourselves, who are they? What are they like? How capable are we at dealing with them? Well, every single encounter that I think I've read about by people who either have said that they've had an abduction experience or some kind of encounter with them has left me thinking that they are very highly telepathic. They have an ability to get inside our heads. So that's one thing. Another thing, well, this is sort of along the same lines, the ability to manipulate the human mind. Time and again, I've spoken directly with people, and I've read a number of accounts where people do things and think things in the midst of an encounter with these craft or these beings that just make absolutely no sense. People falling asleep in the middle of an encounter. People going into hysterical fits. I mean, yes, you'd be terrified. I think terror is a totally reasonable response to some of these encounters, but to such extreme degrees. Or kind of unnatural calm, on the other hand. It seems that they can manipulate us. And then there's the whole memory manipulation. People who have had abduction experiences, or at least appear to have had abduction experiences, let's just say, where it seems that they're living. And David Jacobs wrote a book. One of his books was called Secret Life. I think that's a very apt title the more I think about this. It seems that there are many people who may have a truly secret life. They may not even be aware of it, where part of your mind gets split off into this other reality that gets turned on. We know a lot about mind control history in our own country, hypnosis. My God, back in the late 40s and early 50s, at the latest, U.S. military developed incredible capabilities in mind control technologies, and mind control techniques. So how difficult is it to assume that they have gotten a little bit further along? I mentioned the fear. If we're dealing with them, it's just something that for us to keep in mind that there are many, many people who are terrified of their encounters with these other beings. I also think that based on the evidence that's available to us, that there's more than one group of them, more than one species of them, and very likely with different agendas. Some of them are taking some of us. Are they creating a hybrid species? How truthful are they? Our government certainly is not particularly truthful about this topic. How truthful are these probable aliens or these extraterrestrials? There's two things that I think we can take to the bank. One is that they don't really they're not interested in coming out to us yet in an open way. They operate by stealth. And then the other thing is that our jets are chasing them on a regular basis. And not just our jets, but other national air forces as well. So, again, there's some kind of trouble in paradise. But then you have a whole other side of this. This is something that I will admit to you I didn't really take very seriously for a long time. I still don't really know what I think about it, but it's the claims of people who not have abduction experience, but contact experiences, who talk about the good ETs, the star beings, and the space brothers, and the people, the extraterrestrials who are here to help us. When we deal with exopolitics and people who write about exopolitics, Alfred Weber, Michael Salla predominantly, I think it's fair to say that their take on ETs is generally speaking benign. Michael has, I think, a bit more nuanced analysis of it. But there's a kind of a dominant idea that the extraterrestrials are, good, and that they are here to help us go to the next level of our existence. Well, I don't know. A lot of this is based on channeled information. I used to never, ever think that any of that was legitimate, but to be honest with you, I'm quite persuaded that things like remote viewing are real. I certainly believe that they have an ability to communicate telepathically with us. So logically, I think it would be very grossly premature of me to say that it's impossible, that that's true. And just, you know, I've read enough accounts, I've spoken to enough people who've told me they've had positive experiences with extraterrestrials. I'm thinking, okay, we probably have. So maybe there are several groups out there, probably. Although I would just tell these people, the one thing that I would still maintain is that we really shouldn't necessarily be all that trusting. Because a lot of this has the feeling of wish fulfillment to my mind. And we just have to be careful of believing in things that we want to believe in. That is always when we are most vulnerable. So that's the one thing. And we all know that every one of us here can be manipulated. No one is immune. And so if we're being told things that we want to hear, and certainly we all want to hear that these other beings are good, that they are here to enlighten us, who doesn't want it to hear that? But are we simply being played into their hands? Any discussion of exopolitics has to deal with the issue of abductions. I don't see how anyone can legitimately ignore this. All right? Are there abductions taking place? I personally believe the answer is yes. And if so, then what is going on? Is there a valid, good reason that they're doing this? Well, I don't know. I'm not part of their club, so they haven't really told me. But I have very strong feelings about people coming into my home without my permission, who might take me or my children or my wife. I think that that's very problematic on an ethical basis. So what is going on, right? I don't see exopolitical discussions that really deal with this. So when we're dealing with these other beings, let's just recap a little bit here. We have to assume they have extreme levels of intelligence. They have psychic ability. So how do we deal with such people? I mean, it would be very difficult not to feel stupid when you're standing in front of them, wouldn't it? Or to feel intimidated. To feel like, you know, you're the dog and they're the owner. Is that how it might be with us? I don't think that we're in a position where we can say that we're able to deal with them as equals. Now, again, maybe they'll help, you know, elevate us, right? Well, but it does seem to me that in our history of dealing with them, we haven't done it on our terms, we've done it on their terms. So these are factors in developing an exopolitics, it seems to me. But there's more to this. I don't think that it's going to be, for a long period of time, that we're going to be these helpless little babies. I think that we are right now at a point in our history where we are of absolutely extreme paramount interest to them. We went, you know, it's only a little over 100 years ago where the technology that we lived, that's a Van Gogh drawing of a peasant in a field in France. Not that long ago, and he's got this little hand hoe and very rustic. That had been the way human beings had lived for millennia. And we go from that to now a world in which, well, it's a very different sort of thing. We went from no electricity to having telephones, to having cars, to having radios, to having televisions, to having atomic bombs, to having computers, to having artificial intelligence, which, according to AI experts, we're about 10 to 15 years away from having computers that will talk to you and tell you that they're conscious, and in which some have argued you're probably going to accept those claims. So in really the wink of an eye, we've gone through an exceptional level of development. And so if any beings that are here watching us, how could they not be interested in that development? 100 years ago, we were in no capacity, we had no ability to deal with them. If they wanted to fly through the sky, there was nothing we could do about it. But now there are maybe some things we can do about it. We have some pretty nifty weapons now. I'm not saying that we're necessarily on their level, but how long will it be before we really might be? So, for example, near future technology. Again, this is not UFO stuff. This is very mainstream scientists who get paid a lot of money to study these matters, unlike me, are generally saying we're moving toward a future. We're already in a situation where computers are almost embedded everywhere now, and they will be truly embedded everywhere, where computers will exceed human intelligence, where the human genome will be understood. We're moving already. Nanotechnology in 2008 is shooting up in practical and all types of applications are being foreseen now in a way that even a few years ago were not. Nanotech is real, and it is the future. Nanofactories, think Replicator from Star Trek. This has been theorized that it will be possible in the next decade or two. That the human brain will be decoded and uploaded. So you can, I don't know, copy and paste your intelligence and your mind to a computer. And then, you know, you can have the argument. I'll be saying, I'm Rich Dolan. No, I'm Rich Dolan. I'm Rich Dolan. You can have this, you too can have this argument. Computers that will claim to be conscious. And then I don't even pretend that I understand truly what quantum computing will be, except that the people who write about it have said that this is another vast order of magnitude beyond what we currently have in our computing. So all of this within the next 20, 30 years from now, it's like Star Trek. But only it won't be the 22nd or 23rd century. It will be the 21st century, and many people sitting here today will see it, possibly. So very, very rapid, necessarily something that would have to be of great interest to them. So, all of which means that we could, in fact, be worrisome to them. I don't know if we are. I'm just putting this out there as a possibility. They might be looking at us thinking, they're very intelligent. They're on a path. They're on a kind of exponential growth path for their technology. They do have a history of street fighting, and so maybe that's an issue. So with that in mind, would they want to influence us, or would they want to control us? This is a question that I ask myself. I think that they would want to. That doesn't mean that they are. The near future, we're in such a rapid development of change. It seems to me that it can't be much longer before our entire society is reconfigured, and that part of that will include a kind of foundational knowledge and acceptance of the ET reality here. I think that that's true. And it's simply because of the rapid strides that we are making currently. And this is basically just what I said. The reason the technology is changing too fast, too many opportunities to break the secrecy, including the use of advanced artificial intelligence. Yeah. So that, frankly, I think I have a hard time seeing why they would not be trying to influence our civilization, or even infiltrate our civilization. I have no factual evidence to base this on, okay? So let me just be clear about that. But again, if I were pulled to be on a team to study this, I can tell you that I would be asking this question. More exopolitical problems. What if it turns out that there are ETs that look like us? I mean, one thing that an alien would want to do, possibly, is to breed their own humans. Seems to me to be a reasonable thing to do. Someone's calling me. Wow, how about that? So you breed your own humans, and you might enhance them, perhaps. So you might put little implants in them, I don't know. Genetically make them special or better, and you have them do things for you. That's one possibility. And then you just send them topside, and you have them do things. Probably something not just sweeping the floors, but maybe something important. Or perhaps they have a way of getting into the head of pivotal individuals, or just buying them off. There's all kinds of ways that they could want to influence our society, to control the pivotal nodes of power in our civilization. Again, it's a what if. I'm not saying it is. And along those lines, what if some of them hold positions of power in our society? What if we learn that there are many factions of them and they don't all like each other? So then that would be an exopolitical dilemma, because presumably we humans might have to decide where we stand in all of this. What if we do discover that our militaries have been engaged in a war with them? Then you'll have to have the situation of, we might presume that we're the good guys, but are we the good guys? I guarantee you there'd be humans living on this planet who would probably assume that we're not the good guys, and there'd be others who would assume that we are the good guys. Is it that hard to see that this could be a very divisive issue in our society? Not hard at all. What if we learn that they created us, that they are the gods of ancient times, as it were? That might change our attitude about them. Then we have some much more tangible, immediate problems that would occur with a kind of disclosure. I mean, this is the problem that any kind of disclosure scenario happens. Pretend that the president makes his announcement, and he says, well, UFOs apparently are real, they are alien. Well, I'm sure what he'd want to do next is say, I'm going on vacation for 3 months. See ya. My secretary will answer your questions. But the fact is that there are a lot of questions that would come up as a result of this, and they're not easy ones to deal with. I mean, first of all, I could imagine finally one of the comatose journalists finally waking up and saying, oh my God, well, what about these claims that people are being abducted, Mr. President? Suddenly it doesn't sound so crazy if you admit that they're here. Suddenly it doesn't seem outrageous that some of them have been taking some of us. Or claims that there are underground bases, alien bases. Suddenly that seems to be something worthwhile looking into. And then you start dealing with this entire black infrastructure that's been there to support it. And there's a lot of issues that would come up that are not necessarily fun to deal with. So how do you undo a lie that's this big? Again, I keep referring back to my good friend Stephen Bassett, who says, look, it's really not that big a deal because you can just say it was national security, we had to do it, and now it's out. Well, okay, you can do that, but now you have a lot of issues that are necessarily going to come up. There's really no way to avoid it. For example, what about economic disruptions that will occur as a result of this? I mean, we still have an economy. If the aliens have a better version of our petroleum or steel, which probably they do, sure, for the betterment of humanity, I think we can all agree that, yeah, there's something better than petroleum. We need to do that. But there are, let's remember, important financial interests in the society that we have and in the economic systems that we have. And then there's just this other issue about free energy. Everyone talks about free energy. We need free energy. Wouldn't that be great? Well, yeah, I guess it would be. I'd like to have free energy, I admit. I could do some cool things with it. But do we really want over 6.5 billion people having free energy? And you could make some pretty neat bombs with free energy. Not everyone is stable. Not everyone is sane. Not everyone is good. And so I could imagine, again, this is a completely fictional scenario that I think about, but let's say that there are people in the secrecy power structure who recognize that, yes, this is free energy. We have it right here. Okay, this is the technology. We know how to use it, and it works. It's great. You could heat your home for free for the rest of your life. Okay. But what if that same technology allowed you to make a bomb that could blow up half the Pacific Ocean? Then what? How do we let this out in a way that's not going to result in that with sufficient control? And what if, realistically, there isn't such a system in place right now? So that could be a problem. Is there the possibility of social panic? You know, vigilantes looking for aliens. You're an alien, get her, you know, witch hunts. That's really not that outrageous to imagine happening. People do all kinds of crazy things. And again, I will say that in my earlier years looking into this, I didn't take the idea of social panic as seriously as I think I would today. I suspect that the panic would be a short-term thing, not a long-term thing, but it would be a big deal in the short run. I have spoken to many people who discover that I'm interested in the UFO topic, and they'll say, oh, wow, I love UFOs too. I'm thinking, well, I don't really love UFOs, but I'm interested in it. And then they'll chat with me for a little while, and I've seen this happen more than one time, where someone will then just change their expression, and they'll develop this look of actual fear, because they'll see that I actually do take it seriously, that to me it's real, that there are non-human beings that are interacting on this planet, and suddenly it's not this little what-if fun game, like what if there are people out there? It's not a little puzzle. It's something that's dramatic and threatening, and they don't want to deal with it. And these aren't just, I mean, many of these individuals are highly educated, sophisticated people, and they do not like confronting that issue. Will we experience a kind of a third world paradigm in that, you know, you get the modernizers and the traditionalists? Guaranteed. Guaranteed that'll happen. When if it comes out that we announce that, you know, they're here, we will see that. There will be the modern version of the Luddites who want to prevent the ETs from dominating our society and transforming us, and those who say, no, this is the way. Don't know how that will play out. Can the current human power structure survive disclosure? I think this is an absolutely paramount question for the near term. I keep thinking back to the example of the Soviet Union when Gorbachev came into power in 1985, talking about glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring. It was, at the time, a very exciting moment in Soviet history, unforeseen. And it seemed great, except that 6 years later, there was no Soviet Union. Because you talk about openness, and then suddenly the people in Azerbaijan say, oh, openness, great. Actually, we don't want to be in your country anymore. The Baltic states, ditto. Oh, yeah, it took us over in 1940. We didn't really like that. We're gone. Gorbachev wanted to say, no, I didn't mean that. But it was a little bit too late. And so that once the process of reform took place, it spiraled out of his control, and the next thing you know, it's a different world. Could that happen here? Absolutely. Of course it could. And so when you start on a revolutionary process, nobody knows where we're going to end up. But if you're in the position of power to start with, it's not hard to see that you would have an incentive for not rocking the boat. I mentioned lawsuits here. One thing that was brought to my attention was lawsuits. It sounds so mundane. But let's say I'm one major defense contractor, and I discovered that my competitor for decades has gotten insider ET technology to work off of beating me out on contracts. Would I want to institute a lawsuit? Hell yes, of course I would. Okay? And just lots of messy little things like that. Would disclosure result in elites thinking that they need to implement more repressive measures over our society? We tend to have an idea that disclosure will mean that it will be this wonderful thing. I believe in disclosure, by the way. I'm giving you these negative Nelly arguments right now. I do believe in disclosure. I'll tell you why in a minute. But this is not a slam dunk. So if it comes out, it could be that it doesn't have to be that this is the paradise. It doesn't have to be that way. There's nothing inherently saying that it was. And then there's religion. Another issue that I sort of dismissed personally as a factor for years. But it's a religious world. People, you know, the very few people who are at the top of the socioeconomic spectrum, education, sure, it's not as big a thing for them. But most of the world is not like that. And most people do take their religions very seriously. I'm sure there are people in this room who take their religions very seriously. Would the world religions help or hinder the process of disclosure? I don't know. You hear a lot about Islam, which believes that there are other civilizations out there, so maybe it wouldn't be a problem for that religion, or maybe it would, I don't know. The devil is in the details. Christianity, someone comes out and says, you know, Jesus was an alien. In fact, I actually don't believe that. And when I hear that, that almost makes me think that, you know, goodbye. I don't believe that Jesus was an alien because I don't believe personally that our understanding of Jesus is anything remotely like what we think it is. So when people say that to me, I just think, no. Of course, I've been wrong about many things in my life. I reserve the right to be wrong about things in the future. Okay. But the thing is, how will disclosure affect the world religions? A lot of our world is wrapped up in our attachments to certain ideas. These are attachments, ultimately, that have to be let go. They have to be. We get worked up over what we believe to be true. We have to remind ourselves that throughout our history as a civilization, most of the things that we believed have been totally wrong. And so that, very likely, much of what we believe today is also wrong. The Vatican, I just thought of this. How would disclosure affect the Vatican? The Vatican is very powerful, and they scare a lot of people. I don't know how the Vatican plays into all of this. I suspect that there are secrets there. I suspect that there are some very profound secrets in the Vatican, and some of them might have something to do with this topic. It's just a guess. I'm nearing the home stretch. Despite my careful preparation, I'm afraid I may go over a little bit, so hopefully it won't be a big problem. Are we ready for them? Because at some point, if and when disclosure happens, we're going to have to interact with them. Can we do this? Are we better prepared now than we were in the past? I think the answer is probably yes. I think we are. On the other hand, is much of our mainstream culture in a position of helping us along the path? Television. People, I don't know how much TV you watch in the course of your day. A lot of people watch a lot of TV, and there's a lot of stupid stuff going into our heads. Is this helping to prepare us for dealing with beings who are more intelligent and more psychic than we are? The answer is probably not. Likewise, our political and higher education systems. Are they truly helping us move along that direction? This next bullet says, the few of us, the many of us. I think what I mean by that is that there are always an educated minority who probably are ready. I think people who gravitate to this field are much more likely to be in that group. They are more likely to be ready. But there are a lot of people who are not going to be ready. No matter what we do or say, they ain't going to be ready. It's going to hit them, and it's going to be a shock. What do we expect our interaction with them to do? Are they going to make us better? Are they going to save our sorry butts? We're in big trouble right now in a lot of ways in our civilization. Are they going to do that? Did the Europeans who came across the oceans help the Incas and the Aztecs and the Native Americans who were in North America? Well, you can answer that yourself. Right? No matter what happens, ultimately we have to live with ourselves. with who we are. That sounds trite, but that's really what it comes down to. No matter what they are, what they do, we still have to live in our own heads. But if we're going to deal with them, if nothing else, I would suggest that we need cultural developments that are going to move us in a direction where we're more able to deal with them. I don't see such developments taking place. So I think change is going to come, even though we're not ready for them. I think we're not ready for them. But of course, who's ever ready for anything? I had kids. I wasn't ready for my children. What parent is ready for their kids? I haven't met anyone yet. So things will get forced upon us, and in all likelihood, we might learn to cope. I think that change has to come because the continued secrecy that we have had all these years, yes, okay, it's understandable how secrecy can start, but when you have secrecy for 60 years, it's unhealthy, I think. And I think it does bad things to a society. I think it creates a kind of neurosis. I'm not a psychologist, okay, this is pop psychology, but I think that when you are living a fundamental lie about your world for a long period of time, that it worms its way into your mind. And I think it does bad things. So, I mean, I think in a lot of ways that there's a fundamental dishonesty that's taking place in our culture, not just about the UFO thing, but a lot of things. I mean, look, I was driving down with my wife. We live in Rochester. It's about 400 miles away. So we drove all through Pennsylvania, all right? Now, we're looking at the highway signs. There's political signs up. Do you want to take a guess who all the political signs were for? They were not for McCain. They were not for Obama. They were not for Hillary. They were for Ron Paul. Good grief, man. I saw about a dozen or 15 Ron Paul signs along Route 15 going south on Pennsylvania Turnpike. I saw one Hillary sign. That's it, man. The only thing that rivaled the Ron Paul signs were the adult novelty shops. Pennsylvania, it's like Amish territory. It makes you wonder, is there something about the Amish people we don't know? Do we want in? But I guess what I'm saying, let me get back to this. It's a fundamental dishonesty just regarding that. And look, everyone's got their own political opinion here, but the fact is, it's obvious to everyone here that that man generated a tremendous amount of grassroots support. People love this guy. He has no corporate backing, and yet he's got millions of people who talk about him, and the media has completely ignored him like he doesn't exist. That does bad things to a society. That's like what would happen in the Soviet Union, and we saw what happened there, okay? So that's what I'm saying. When you have a culture based on secrecy and lies, it does bad things. And so for that reason, I think change must come. We have learned to lie to ourselves. We don't want to do that. Now why change will come. I said why change must come. This is why I think change will come. I say it's obvious. I think it is obvious. Because we are living through a period of time that is marked by change, by radical change. I mentioned briefly the technological revolution that we've gone through really in the last century. It's obviously not going to stop, right? Where will we be 10 years, 20, 30, 50 years from now? I think it's safe to say that it won't be in the same place that we're in now, wherever that will be. It'll be something that could be just completely beyond anything that we can even imagine right now. And so in a situation like that, when you have radical technological, economic changes, it's going to breed radical political change. How can it not again? How can it not? You have major changes here. At some point, it's going to make major changes in our politics, political instability. My own observation of the last 30, 35 years of political changes, you find there's a lot of UFO-related data that comes out during political instability in many of these nations of the world. I mentioned the Soviet Union. When they were in their state of collapse, leaks came out. Okay, these weren't leaks that ended up breaking the total wall of secrecy, but they were significant. It happened in China when Mao died. It happened in Spain when Franco died. It happened after our own political crisis of Watergate, to a large extent. A lot of secrets came out through the Freedom of Information Act, which was a direct result of that political crisis. So major change, I think, will breed, major political change will breed many opportunities for major leaks to occur, which could result in a disclosure, opportunities for disclosure. And so it could be a sunrise. Let's hope it isn't a sunset. I remain optimistic. I think that there are severe challenges to releasing or acknowledging this reality. But I'll tell you right now, I'm not a 2012er. I do not believe. I just don't. I'm sorry. I don't believe that we're at the end of the road in 2012. And I think that we will continue. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't have dramatic changes that will continue to take place in our society. But I think that we will continue to exist. And I think that we have a chance of getting over this very dangerous tightrope that we are currently on as a society. The tightrope is, you think of it as a very, very high wire tightrope, and we're trying to walk across this little thing right now. If we fall, that is, if we have an infrastructure meltdown, I don't know, petroleum, water, nuclear attack, fill in the blank, we could fall very, very far down to an infrastructure level that would make life impossible for many people. Because, after all, you can't really have 6.6 billion people living in the world without a petroleum-based economy, not at this point. If we don't have anything to replace it, then the only thing you can do is die, because there's really nothing else to replace that right now. But now, if we get to the other side of that tightrope without falling, if we can hang on, we might have a very wild ride ahead of us, and it might be really great. Then again, it might be a little less great than we hope. There's all kinds of possibilities. The last thing that I would mention here is that when a disclosure occurs, it will have to occur. I believe this. We just have to, the people, I'm saying, we the people, the outsiders, as Steve Bassett referred to us, I think quite appropriately, can't just lie back and accept whatever is handed to us as the gospel truth. Someone wanted to clap for that. You should. Okay. Because we learned about this little thing called spin. And so if and when it happens, I think it's safe to say there's going to be a lot of spin control over it in one way or the other. So there will be a continued need for people to look at this topic independently, objectively, from the outside, and to do everything that we can do to keep the process honest. Nothing is assured. There'll probably be much more failure than success, and that's just the way it is. But that's no reason not to do it. So I consider it a very great privilege, and indeed I consider it an honor to be asked to speak here before all of you on this topic. I hope it's been engaging for you. Thank you very much.
Showing me up by dressing so much better than I do.
besides what's